Hey everyone, we've got a fascinating deep dive for you today. You sent us this analysis of Harvard, and it's not like your typical rankings review.
Yeah.
It's more like someone took Wall Street's buy, sell, or hold approach and applied it to Harvard, like this Ivy League
It's
giant.
a really unique angle, right? We're so used to hearing about prestige and legacy when it comes to these institutions, but this analysis looks at Harvard almost like a company.
Right.
They're digging into the financials, the endowment, even the return on investment for students, which is a pretty thought-provoking way to approach it.
Right, like, can we really put a price tag on a Harvard education?
Yeah.
That's what this analysis is trying to figure out.
Yeah.
And they don't shy away from the big numbers. We're talking a $51 billion endowment,
Yeah.
which is more than some countries' GDP.
It's an incredible amount of resources, but the report highlights that despite this wealth, the cost of actually attending Harvard has skyrocketed. We're talking a doubling of tuition in just the last 2 decades.
Okay, so let's unpack that. If you're a student or more likely a family looking at that kind of price tag, you want to be sure it's worth it, right?
Exactly. And that's where the investor mindset comes in. The analysis digs into whether the quality of education at Harvard justifies the ever-increasing cost.
And what do they find?
Well, the report argues that the return on investment for a Harvard degree may not be what it once was. They cite things like grade inflation, where the average GPA has risen dramatically from a 2.6 in the 1960s to a 3.8 today.
Wow, 3.8. You practically have to try to not graduate with honors these days.
It does raise questions about academic rigor, and the report goes further, suggesting that starting salaries for graduates in many fields haven't kept pace with the rising cost of tuition. So it begs the question, is that Harvard degree still the golden ticket it's often made out to be?
Fascinating. So we're seeing this potential disconnect between the price tag and the perceived value of a Harvard education.
Yes, and it's not just about the money. The report also raises concerns about how Harvard allocates its resources, specifically when it comes to faculty.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't fluent in academic jargon, what does faculty allocation actually mean?
It essentially refers to where Harvard chooses to invest its resources in terms of hiring professors and building up different departments.
Guys, where are they putting their money?
That's where it gets really interesting. While some departments like economics and computer science have seen faculty growth that's at least somewhat in line with student demand, other areas tell a different story.
Like what? Spill the tea.
Well, the report highlights the African and African American Studies Department as a particularly striking example. Despite a huge increase in faculty numbers, the number of degrees awarded in that department is actually declining.
Wait, really? So they're adding all these professors, but fewer students are graduated with degrees in that field?
Exactly. In the most recent year, they analyzed only one student graduated with a degree in African and African American studies.
Wow, just one. That's wild, especially compared to a department like economics, where they're granting far more degrees than they have faculty.
It's a stark contrast. Now, the report doesn't definitively conclude why this is happening, but they do point to it as an example of a potential mismatch between where resources are being allocated and actual student interest.
Okay, so we've got rising costs, questions about the value of the education itself, and now this potential disconnect with faculty allocations. Like, this analysis is peeling back layers of the Harvard onion, and what we're finding is, well, let's just say it's more complicated than it seems from the outside.
You've hit the nail on the head, and it gets even more complex when we start to look at Harvard's mission, which, as the report points out, has undergone some significant changes over the years.
Oh, right. I read something about that. It used to be just veritas, right? Latin for truth. Short, sweet, to the point.
Exactly. And over time, it evolved to encompass broader ideas about knowledge critical thinking. And even at one point, godliness was in there. But in 2020, the university adopted a new mission statement.
What's the verdict? How does it compare to the old veritas days?
Well, the 2020 mission statement, it puts a lot of emphasis on new ideas,
Yeah.
Evolving identities, diversity, and social transformation.
Okay, so it's definitely a shift in tone from that simple veritas.
Right. And the analysis suggests that this shift reflects broader trends within higher education, a move away from the pursuit of objective truth toward a more, let's say, fluid approach to knowledge and social values.
And they use that example of the statement released by those Harvard student groups after the Hamas attacks last year to illustrate this point, right?
Exactly the one where they place the entire blame for the violence on Israel. The analysis argues that this kind of statement, which sparked a lot of debate about academic freedom and free speech, exemplifies the potential risks of prioritizing social and political agendas over open inquiry and a diversity of viewpoints.
It's definitely a complex issue with strong opinions on all sides, and it seems to get at the heart of what this analysis is trying to do, which is to really examine where Harvard as an institution stands today. They're not just looking at the bottom line. They're asking these bigger questions about values, priorities, and the very purpose of higher education in the 21st century.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that Harvard is facing these challenges in a rapidly evolving landscape.
Huh.
The report highlights several external pressures that are impacting the university, from declining donations to increased scrutiny from lawmakers about how endowments are managed.
Right? Because it's not like Harvard exists in a bubble. They're operating in the real world with real-world pressures.
Precisely. And one of the biggest pressures they're facing is the rise of alternative education models. Think online courses, specialized boot camps, all these options that offer more targeted learning experiences, often at a lower cost.
It's like the whole disruption thing we see in other industries. Suddenly, the traditional model of a four-year degree is being challenged.
Exactly. And for an institution like Harvard, which has built its reputation on that traditional model, that's a significant challenge. They're having to adapt to a world where students have more choices, more information, and are increasingly questioning the value proposition of a traditional degree, especially given the rising cost.
So it's not just about whether Harvard has stayed true to its core values, but also whether those values still resonate in today's world.
Right, it's a question of relevance and how an institution with such a long and storied history navigates the demands of a rapidly changing present. And of course, it remains to be seen whether the changes Harvard is making are enough to ensure its continued success in this evolving landscape.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, the external pressures, and some of the internal shifts happening at Harvard. But let's cut to the chase. What's the bottom line after all this analysis? What's the verdict? Buy, sell, or hold?
Well, after weighing all these factors, the report ultimately concludes that Harvard is a hold.
A hold, so not a resounding endorsement.
Not quite. They acknowledge Harvard's undeniable strengths, its brand recognition, its vast resources, the incredible network of alumni. But they also emphasize that there are serious challenges ahead, some of which we've discussed.
It's a hold with a giant asterisk next to it. Proceed with caution.
In a sense, yes, they seem to be saying, don't count Harvard out just yet, but don't assume its past glory guarantees future success.
It's almost like they're leaving it up to us, the listeners, to decide what we think.
And in a way they are. This analysis isn't meant to be the final word on Harvard. It's meant to be a starting point for a larger conversation.
A conversation about what?
A conversation about what we value in education, in institutions, and in society as a whole, because those values are constantly evolving, just as Harvard itself is evolving.
That's a really interesting way to frame it. It's not just about Harvard. It's about what we as individuals prioritize and seek out in a world that's changing faster than ever. It feels like this whole analysis is prompting us to look beyond the rankings and the reputation and really ask ourselves what matters most when it comes to education.
Precisely. And that's what makes this deep dive so valuable. It's not just about whether Harvard is a buy or a sell, but about encouraging you to think critically about your own values and priorities.
So for our listeners out there, whether they're considering Harvard another university or just trying to make sense of this whole complex landscape of higher education, what key takeaways should they keep in mind?
I think the biggest one is to look beyond the brand name. The report makes a compelling case that just because a university has a prestigious history doesn't necessarily guarantee a quality education or a worthwhile return on your investment today.
Right. It's like that old saying, past performance is not indicative of future results.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You need to do your own due diligence research. The faculty, look at the curriculum, consider what's important to you in terms of academic culture and environment.
Yeah, don't just take their word for it, even if that they is Harvard University.
Right. And speaking of not taking things at face value, another key takeaway is to be wary of mission statements. Universities, like any organization, can try to present themselves in a certain light, right? The report encourages a healthy dose of skepticism to look beyond the marketing and examine what the institution's actions and priorities truly reveal.
So dig a little deeper, ask the tough questions, and see if their walk matches their talk.
Exactly. And I think the final takeaway, which builds on what we were just discussing about individual values, is to define what success really means to you.
Okay, unpack that one for me. What do you mean?
Well, for some, success might mean attending a prestigious university like Harvard, right? But for others, it might mean finding a program that aligns with their specific interests, even if it's not at a big name school. Or maybe it's about prioritizing affordability or flexibility over tradition.
So it's less about checking off a box and more about defining your own path.
Exactly. And that path might lead you to Harvard, or it might lead you somewhere else entirely. The important thing is that it's a path that you've chosen thoughtfully based on your own values and aspirations.
That's a great point to end on this whole hold rating on Harvard. It's really a hold rating on accepting any institution at face value. It's about doing your homework, asking the right questions, and ultimately deciding what matters most to you.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, there you have it, folks. A deep dive into the curious case of Harvard, which, as it turns out, is really a deep dive into the evolving landscape of higher education and what we should be asking of these institutions. A big thanks to our expert for guiding us through this thought-provoking analysis.
My pleasure. Always happy to be here.
And to our listeners, as always, thank you for joining us on this journey of intellectual exploration. Keep those minds curious, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.